Okay, I'm going to do a drawing tutorial today. It's also a bit of a test of the new iPad Pro. The very first video that I did, testing the first iPad Pro, the first generation, bear in mind this is the third generation, was the first drawing I did was of a pine cone. And on that particular instance, I was drawing from a real pine cone that was in front of me. On this tutorial, I want to show how it's possible to draw a pine cone without even having a reference in front of you. Now, it's one of those things in nature that I think is wonderful in the fact that it has a structure to it, a pattern, if you like. Certain rules that it seems to conform to. Not to say that the rules themselves are always 100% consistent, but if you understand the general pattern, then you can go quite a long way with that. Now, just in case you're wondering what program I'm using, if you're new to iPad art and iPad drawing, and my channel for that matter, this is Procreate, and I've just opened an A4 canvas. I have selected the brush as a 6B pencil, just want to try and recreate the drawing experience on the iPad. And I found that this and these settings are pretty much the closest you can get, and it feels very, very natural, very similar to the experience of drawing on paper, to the point now where I don't really choose to pick up a pencil and paper. I tend to go straight for the iPad these days. So in terms of drawing a pine cone, you need to get an overall shape. You might wish to do an egg shape, maybe come slightly more to a point at the top. And the good thing about drawing digitally is obviously that you can reposition things if you decide that you don't want to rub out the whole thing, you don't want to erase it, but you just want to reposition things. And also you can use layers. So as I was saying, there is a general structure and a pattern that you might find in something like a pine cone. Now, the way that it presents when you're looking at it from the side, certainly, is that you will get lines that curve like this. So it follows the shape, so you get a general sort of wave shape, like an S shape, but very slight, very subtle. You might have it more obvious near the top on one side like that. And what you might find is the lines get a little bit closer together near the bottom, like so. So that'll do for one way, and I'm going to do exactly the same but in the other direction now. So I'll curve it up at the top, have it cross in the middle, and then maybe just curve just ever so slightly down that way, but really not very much. Again, curve it across. Now some pine cones are going to be different. Sometimes a really small one won't have too many of these lines that cross each other. Sometimes on a bigger one, you're going to get a more dramatic number of parts of the pine cone that actually cross each other. Okay, I hope you can pick up on that on camera. I might just go over it a little bit, just so you can see it more clearly. This, however, is going to be used as a guide. I'm going to use this to inform what I do, but I don't really want these particular lines showing up at the end of the drawing. So I will be reducing the opacity of the layer. I'm just going to use them literally as a sense of where to put things. So now, having created a second layer, I'm going to start using the bottom part of each of these diamond shapes. Now, if you use the biggest part of it, so if you use most of it like this, and you start to just round off the top section, but you use the bottom part of the diamond shape and start filling it in like this, you're going to end up with what looks like a very closed pine cone. I'm not going to do that. I want to show a more open version. So what I intend to do is just use the bottom portion of the pine cone, and that spaces them further apart, and therefore you get to see more of the open shape of the pine cone. Because what tends to happen when the pine cone opens up is that it tends to make the pine cone look bigger by moving all these components, these different bits, further apart. So I'm using this now just as a rough guide. I'm probably going to use another layer. This is just building it up in stages. So you can see I'm using the bottom part of that diamond shape, rounding it off at the top. And again, this is going to be the second part of my guide. If you were to use a real pencil and paper, you might just start to sketch these parts in lightly. They're going to be useful, but again, these are not the finished look that I'm going for. They're just placing in some of the important features. So again, if I just summarize, if you have a diamond shape, I'm concentrating on keeping the bottom part of it, so I'm rounding it off like this. So this is the section that I'm going to keep there, and I'm going to lose that top section. Maybe when they get to the bottom, rather than reducing the size of the triangles or the bottom part of the diamond shapes too much, they will get closer together and they will start to close up near the bottom. That is often something that you will find at the bottom of a pine cone, so that's absolutely perfect. You might just, at the edges here, have a couple of bits. If you notice there's empty sections, you might just get a suggestion of one that's going around the corner. Like here, for example, you might just have one section there, another one there. Okay, so that is the next stage of the guide. I'm going to create another layer. I think what I need to do on the layer underneath now is reduce the opacity so I can still see it, but it's not going to really dominate now. And I can also reduce that layer. In fact, I'm going to reduce the bottom layer so you can hardly see it at all. In fact, to not see it at all, probably at this stage is advantageous. So I'm working on the top layer now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the bottom of the shapes that we have, and I'm going to try and curve them towards this point. So imagine, for example, if this was the bottom of the pine cone, I'm heading them towards there. So if I have a diamond shape there, I'm imagining that line curving there. If I have another diamond shape there, and I'm imagining that line curving towards there, and so on. That's going to help with the overall shapes and just give us a real sense of how these forms are going to be put together. I'm trying to be systematic about this rather than just doing every part all at once. I'm trying to break it down into the different stages just so it's easier to get your head around. It is the kind of form that you could easily get lost in because there's lots going to it, and trying to maintain a sense of pattern can be quite a challenge. Okay, there are some bits there I've not quite finished off, but I'm going to move to the next stage. So now I've done the middle bit, I'm going to go to the two outer corners of each shape, and they are not going to be sharp at the corners, so I don't want to create a complete sharp point like that. I want to create a rounded edge, but then it quickly pinches in and it will start to head towards the center here. Now bear in mind, some of these are not going to fit perfectly with each other. You'll get some overlapping, some bits that you naturally be covered up by the shapes in front of it, and that's all fine. If these were too regularly spaced out, then it wouldn't look as good. Part of the fact that makes it look natural, or part of the effect that looks the most natural, is the slightly randomness that you do see in nature. So a little bit of messiness is all good. So again, we're trying to point them all towards a point here. So if we've got a point there, it's going to go in as if it's curving in, and the same for all of them. So any points now we're bringing down towards that line. Doesn't have to be exactly, it might go slightly more down, but in a general sense, they're heading towards this point at the bottom. So already in terms of the structure, you can see that the pine cone is becoming more visible. I'm just going to get rid of that, because that's going to annoy me. Next thing, because most of our information is on the top layer, if I remove the layer underneath it, you can see it doesn't make very much sense. So I need to just really get to grips with some of these shapes now. In actual fact, although we've got quite straight lines here, I want to exaggerate a curve in here. I'm making the bottom of that, what was the diamond shape, more of a curved, kind of almost like a bird's beak. So it doesn't come to an absolute point in some cases, but certainly more so than it did. So I'm making a more exaggerated version now. So instead of being like that, I want it to be more like that. Once I've done this in a moment, I'm going to delete the layer underneath it, just so I've not got too many lines competing. But I'll need to do this before I can delete the layer underneath, otherwise we'll just be reduced to chaos with it again. What will tend to happen at the bottom here is it becomes less obvious with the sharp point, so it might just become a little bit more rounded at the bottom. Just adding a few random ones at the top there, I want to have a bit more of a point. Can always just double check with the layer underneath if I remove it, see what's visible, what isn't. In fact, I may leave it there until such a point that it makes no difference by removing it. I might as well leave it there. Because I've reduced the opacity of it, it's not having too big an impact on the overall form anyway. Now the next thing I'm going to do is decide on a light source. So I'm going to imagine there's a light coming from one side more than the other. So because that's the case, we're going to have this part of the shape slightly more shaded. So again, I'm going to build this up quite gradually to begin with, but I'm just choosing to shade in this half of this strange little shape now a little bit darker. And it's at this point that you're going to start making a bit more sense of the whole form. You can also start to spot when I've missed some lines out, and that's fine. If you're the kind of person that likes to do every single line in a structure before you start adding shading, that's fine. I tend to just want to get on with the job sometimes. When I've got so far with the line work, I'm just eager to get cracking on the shading. So I'm adding some features along the edge here. It almost like creates a bit of a lip. You might have some lines that follow downwards. You might have some extra shadow parts here. You may even have some shading on the top of it there. But most of the shading is going to be on this half. I'll just finish one section and then we'll use that as the kind of standard for the rest of the piece. Maybe some slight shading on that one, but not too much. It's almost got a grain that comes along here, so you might get some faint lines that follow the shapes there. Maybe, again, some lines that follow over the top there, just to redefine some of that. And then I'm going to use that as a standard now across all the other shapes. Now the bits that's going to be the darkest here is when you're going really deep into the shape. It's not getting as much light in this area down here, and that'll be the same when you encounter it here, for example, or here, straight above it, you can see it. So particularly in this section, right here. Again, some little nooks taken out of the shape. It is an organic shape. It's not going to have completely smooth forms. It'll have some little irregular bumps, which to be honest, is going to make it all the more interesting in the end. So once you've got the general pattern correct, having these little points of interest, these little irregularities in the smoothness of the forms is actually going to what's going to make it look more believable. So whilst I really love drawing realistic things like this, and I've spent many hours, hundreds of hours, thousands of hours drawing from real objects, sometimes I really like to just go to town and make things up. Now I've started a new channel that's going to be dedicated to slightly more surreal, collaborative drawings with my subscribers. There is a link for that if you're interested down in the description. If you want to go and have a look, please subscribe, take part. You can send me your interpretations of the sketches that I start over there, which generally are quite strange, quite weird, what we'd call surreal and automatic drawing techniques, much like the surrealists used to use. And if you're interested in slightly more creative projects, then check that out. But I find it useful to really understand this kind of subject matter, because if you understand how to construct certain patterns and textures, then even when you're creating your own artwork that is just made up, to understand how things are structured in the real world, elements of nature, natural forms like this, then it really can just help advance your own imagination forward quite a lot. If you're somebody that wants to get better at drawing and isn't quite sure the best way to do it, then I honestly suggest that observation of nature is one of the best ways of really getting better at being creative and better at drawing. Because even when it comes to understanding patterns, and if you wanted to get into architecture even, for example, so you're interested in quite technical drawings, I think that many architects and artists now look to nature for inspiration too. So I think it's a fantastic thing to just look at and learn from. It's really important when you get some sections back here where you've got lots of parts of the pine cone covering it, that you get some real dark shadows in those sections. There isn't going to be any light penetrating in some of these areas. Doesn't matter if it's lost the sense of the pattern in areas. It's a general rule, but it's not a hard and fast rule. So I'm going to start using a lot more shadow down in the lower sections now. The light's coming from up here. It's going to hit this part of the pinecone more, but underneath we're definitely going to see more shadow. So as we get towards the bottom section, even the top of these shapes here are going to have more shadow. So at the upper areas, we're going to have mainly light in this area, but as we get down here, the whole thing is going to be more in shadow. This is not a copy from a picture. This is just trying to understand. This is understanding how pinecones are structured. Like I showed in my first iPad drawing, I did have an actual pinecone in front of me and I was copying it, but for this I'm not copying. This is based on understanding how the structure works. I spent a lot of time looking at forms like this. Is the kind of thing that I find really fascinating. So once you've done that for a period of time, you start to see the patterns and you can crack the code. And I find that's the case with most artistic things, really. Most things, that if you've studied something long enough, you'll start to see how the structure works. Now, arguably, I could do a better drawing if I had a real pinecone in front of me. There'd be certain levels of detail and certain quirky points of interest that maybe would show up by copying the real thing. And I'm certainly not suggesting that, making things up from memory is the best route to go, but I'm just demonstrating how, if you do understand the structure and the pattern, you can pretty much produce a good effect just from understanding that. But I think it takes quite a while to really get to grips with these structural patterns. But I think sometimes by having somebody point it out to you, then even when you come to do an observational drawing, because you understand what you're looking out for, you've had it pointed out to you, then you should end up with a better version of it, even when you're still copying. I think sometimes you can't really see something, even when it's right in front of you, until you realise it's there. So sometimes when you're shown something and then it's difficult to not see it. So I think, to be honest, the value of this type of tutorial, I think, is really just highlighting the kind of things to look out for. That's what I imagine the best thing about this kind of tutorial is, anyway, from my perspective. If there are other things from nature that you'd like to see demonstrated like this, then please feel free to leave those suggestions in the comments. I do take the comments very seriously. I try to answer the majority of them. Sometimes they slip away from me and I don't manage to reply to all of them. I prefer it when they are subject matter related rather than just questions about the screen protector I might be using. In terms of that, just to answer that question now, I'm not using a screen protector as of yet. I'm still doing some research and I probably will get a screen protector because my last iPad I ended up with a scratch on it and I don't really want to be in that position again. To be honest, the scratch didn't bother me that much, but it's the kind of thing that can affect the resale value later on if you do eventually want to upgrade. And obviously, sometimes those scratches rather, can lead to cracks and breaks in the glass itself. So I do recommend getting a screen protector. I just haven't tried one yet. I may try to get one that has feel of natural paper to it, and there's a few different options out there I'm yet to try, but I will let you know my thoughts on that if I do get around to trying one. You may already have experience. Again, please feel free to comment on it. But generally I prefer the types of questions and comments or suggestions that are about the actual content of the video, ideally. And they're the ones that primarily I get around to answering the soonest, as a matter of priority. So you can see the form has come together now. I'm just going to do a touch of refinement, but essentially you can see how it works now. Now occasionally I can find bits that need a bit more definition. If it's going into the shadow like this, for example, looks too light compared to the section next to it. That definitely needs a bit more shading to really push it back, push it deeper behind the other forms. Same here. Now, even these top shapes might have a slight roundness to them. They're not completely flat, so you may find it beneficial to add some extra shading to one half of it. Again, not too dramatic, but just a suggestion of it on one side is probably going to create more of a 3D sense to the picture. Sometimes it can be a little detail like that that really makes something look more convincing. What you'll notice on pine cones is that this section here at the bottom tends to have a little feature as well, a little end point. It's almost like a little beak. You can just try and emphasize it a little bit, not overly much. Again, I'm just going to re-emphasize the shading at the bottom here. I could even increase the size of the brush, just going over it, just exaggerating the shadows, especially on the bits between these diamond shapes. Now, I'm not suggesting that you don't use reference, just to make this point clear again. I'm just trying to demonstrate how if you've looked at something enough times, you start to see the patterns, and then you're able to produce an image because you've understood it, even when the object isn't directly in front of you. Another thing to bear in mind is no matter what you're drawing, even if it's a pine cone or a shell or a hand or of someone's face, by studying things you learn about other aspects too, like proportion, scale. Lighting is a really important factor. So for example, on this piece, because I've done lots of drawing where I understand how light affects forms, it means that no matter what shape I draw, I'm able to pretty authentically represent the way that the light might interact. It's not always perfect, and sometimes having that thing in front of you really is beneficial still, but the more you understand the way that things impact on things, then it becomes easier to spot them. Okay, I've not spent terribly long on this. I'm probably going to leave this here for this session. If you want to check out any of my other tutorials, I'll show you how to do landscapes and other subject matter. If you really appreciated what I've shown you here, then you can support me over at my Patreon page. And again, there is a link for that down in the description as well. Anyway, I'll leave that there for today. Hopefully it's been beneficial to watch this. Practice drawing yourself, and I'll catch you back here again. See you later.